And to characterize that, what Will's saying about the water not getting into the soil, we had soil moisture sensors where we had sensors every 4 inches, starting at 4 inches deep, and we weren't getting anything even at 8 inches, any infiltration whatsoever. You know, it didn't matter if he run the system 24 hours or, you know, 14 or whatever it took for it to get through.
We were throwing stuff at the wall just trying to get something to stick.
From a management standpoint, you know, if you've used soil moisture sensors on a lot of other fields or know what the breeding depth and capabilities of corn are, you know, you have roots 36 inches deep, and you can use most of that profile during the irrigation season to basically feed that plant. And when you're only getting 4 or 5 inches of infiltration water in the profile from that irrigation event, we were basically going to hit the threshold for the next irrigation cycle, you know, every 3 to 4 days, basically. And it would never dry out on top, which, you know, obviously it needs to dry out just to take some more water, but there was nothing we could do to improve that situation. And when I look back at, you know, what I hear from reports from farmers and working with them over the years, you know, for years I've heard, you know, I make my best corn on my mixed soils. You know, not the sandy soils or the silt loams, but we have some problems with those. But our soils that have a little bit of clay in them, we can make a lot higher corn yields. And I think that's the main reason why we're getting better water infiltration. We're just doing a lot better job of irrigating and keeping up with the water demands. Whereas, you know, if you only got water in the soil, it don't matter whether it's 4 inches or 8 inches or even 12 inches, it doesn't have much of a reservoir whatsoever to sustain that plant for any amount of time. And you know, if you're fur irrigating where you're putting out a large amount of water, there's no, you know, you don't want to be in a situation, or it's not even practical to come back and irrigate every 4 or 5 days. Whereas most soils, you know, with even at the high use time period for water, most of the time we're looking at 9 to 11 days at peak water use time for irrigation events. And at lower water use times, and it's going to be even longer than that. Any more irrigation questions? Because my topic is completely different than that. And that wasn't really by design, I guess. Last year both of us talked about irrigation, but I'm going to talk this year about plant populations, basically. Obviously, we had a lot of problems with stands last year. I'm not going to talk necessarily about what we can do from a management standpoint to get better stands, but wanted to talk a little bit about the science behind irrigation. And I don't know how many of y'all went to the discussion session this morning, or it's going to be tomorrow again, about variable rate seeding, basically. But some of this I think will tie in with that program very closely. And the point that I got, I guess, from the growers this morning and the experts on that panel was the science behind plant populations and making those decisions is not near what we can do from a technology standpoint with today's planters. We've got a lot more capability with the planters and so forth than what we do to actually make those decisions. So hopefully I'll touch on a few things, I guess, that we might incorporate or think about, or at least stimulate the thought process into what is an optimal plant population for a field on your farm. And that's certainly going to vary between year to year and everything else. Plant populations, when you look at just about any plant population research, you'll see a chart that looks somewhat like this, where you see a very positive response over low plant populations. Then it gets to a point basically where it levels off or plateaus, may even drop off on the high side. But there you basically see a plateau at that high point. And so from a grower's perspective, you want to pick that optimal level where you're going to reach that plateau, but you're not basically seeding at a level above that where you're basically spinning your wheels and not getting a positive response to that important input. But this is pretty normal, and the thing I wanted to point out is that there are other factors like nitrogen that basically perform the exact same way, where we know that those management inputs that we put into the crop, that the crop is very responsive to it. And corn is more responsive than most crops because it's only going to produce one stalk per plant. It's only generally going to produce one ear per plant that doesn't vary its size very much relative to plant population or relative to stand issues and everything else that you might encounter. So corn is very sensitive to plant population. We know that. But why doesn't it respond any better than that? Or why do you see very important inputs, whether it's nitrogen or plant population, where we reach that plateau and it's no longer responsive anymore? Any ideas? Something else probably is becoming a limiting factor at some point in that response curve. And there's a number of things that can be. It could be any of these things on the chart. It could be something that's not on there. But oftentimes you as a grower, a consultant, or a university specialist, you may be able to pick that. It may be different on every farm or every field. So that's something that we have to be aware of. And one of the things, I guess, I found a chart similar to this last year and I updated it significantly this year. This is data from the National Corn Growers Association Yield Contest over about the last 6 years. And it plots all those entries in the contest that exceeded 300 bushels an acre with the plant population that they grew their crop at to produce that 300 bushels an acre yield level or higher. So obviously these are the best of the best corn growers from around the world, and there's several different things that I see when I look at this data. Number one, you've got 80% or more of those entries on this chart that followed no trend whatsoever, basically, or they're at that yield plateau that we showed on the previous slide. In other words, they're not necessarily being responsive to plant population and producing a higher yield like some of those on the chart are. And there's a couple interesting things that you can see looking at that data. Number one, there's only a small percentage of those that you continue to get a positive response, but there is a very nice correlation there. The other thing is, if you look at where this response line, this linear response, bisects 300 bushels per acre, it's a little less than 30,000 plants per acre. So from a management standpoint, what this tells me is that we need to do a little bit better job of identifying what that limiting factor is in our program. It's not just always going to be nitrogen or plant population, and those are the two that growers instantly gravitate towards and generally think that they need to increase those in order to increase their yield potential. It may not be that at all.
Is most of that on 30-inch?
Probably so, absolutely, and I'll get to that a little bit later. That's a very important point. Most of these contest yields are going to be in 30-inch corn. That's just what most of the corn in the United States is grown at. I know Randy Dowdy, when he first started entering the contest, had 36-inch corn, but most of it around the United States is going to be 30-inch corn. And that's not something that was included in this data, obviously, but it's very important to keep in our mind from a decision-making standpoint, particularly the southern corn growers, because response curves like I showed on that chart, I guarantee you that the research data from that was likely generated with 30-inch rows, not 38s, not 40s like Will's farm. So you got to keep that in mind, because that does affect how the plants are going to respond or not respond.
Are we using one on nitrogen, 1 point, I would say, 1 point per bushel or 1.25 per bushel?
Yeah, I mean, most of the folks producing these really high yields are probably around 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel yield goal. They're doing a very good job. They're putting it out efficiently.
That one go past 1?
They may, I guess, but if you ask David Hula and some of those folks generally how much nitrogen that they're applying, it's usually not exceeding that high level. The other thing I'll point out, you can see a little bit of the color difference on here, and I'll talk more about this later, but Irrigated is the blue data points. Dryland data points are the bright green. Nearly all the dryland data points, they're not all in that circle. I couldn't put that circle everywhere, but you see, that's the highest dryland yield there. There's another one out here, but none of the dryland points are really following that optimal response there that's represented by the blue line either. So we know that in dryland situations, water stress is going to come into play, and it's not going to be as responsive, and we generally pick more conservative seeding rates in dryland corn production because of that. I wanted to go back, I guess, to our limiting factors and show this slide here. I developed this a few years ago as kind of an educational tool, but I think that these are the three most important factors that show us and kind of categorize the things that go into increasing our corn yield potential. You've got hybrid selection up there at the top, including crop rotation, obviously plant stands, not only the planting density, planting date, the uniformity of that crop, both from a spacing standpoint as well as a growth disparity standpoint, is extremely critical for corn. And particularly in lean economic times, oftentimes the first thing that gets pulled back is the plant nutrition, soil fertility part of the program. And obviously, that's going to have negative consequences on yield potential as well. The other thing that I'll point out about this chart from an educational standpoint is that we need to keep all these factors in balance. In other words, if we pick what a lot of folks refer to as a racehorse hybrid, we plant it at 38,000 plant population, and we don't manage this quite as well as what we could. Say we're an irrigated grower, we pick an irrigated hybrid, racehorse hybrid, planted at 38,000, and we put out nutrition for whatever yield level you want, 200, 225, 250 bushels an acre. If those components on the other half of the triangle exceed what your plant nutrition or soil compaction issues or something come into play right here, you're probably not going to achieve that 250 bushel an acre yield goal. It's going to fall far short of that, because this limiting factor is going to reduce the yield potential, because there's going to be more competition on those plants because you have too high of a plant population for what this can support over here. So it's very important from a management standpoint to keep these legs of the triangle in balance from optimizing our yield potential. So getting back to the plant population response, this is some research that we did at Mississippi State several years ago. It's fairly old data. It was done somewhere at least 10 years ago, but it very clearly shows the differences between a dryland production system in the green line and the irrigated production system in the blue line. This is going to be fairly consistent from year to year. That green line could be all over the board. It may look like the blue line in a year like last year, where we had plentiful rainfall, and during a more stressful year, it's going to tail off considerably at the higher plant populations. But just keep in mind that the way that plant population responds may vary considerably from year to year, depending upon the environmental conditions, of course. But from a plant population standpoint, I would like to think about what you're really managing with plant population. In the presentation this morning, we kept going back to yield data and things like that, and obviously that's very important. That's one of the things that plant population is affecting, but most people undervalue, I guess, the effect of plant population on light interception, and that's probably the most important thing that plant population is affecting. You want to be intercepting And corn yields the highest when it intercepts about 90% of the available light. So from a management standpoint, if we focus on light interception and how plant population affects that, what we see during the course of the season, what we see with other factors that may affect that, I think we'll get a lot more value out of making better decisions about plant population. So here's an example. I was driving through the Delta a couple years ago and saw this field. What do y'all think affected the difference in plant stature and light interception between these two sides of the field? Obviously, hybrid could come into play, but normally you don't see a 3 foot, 3.5 foot, 4 foot difference in plant height just because of hybrids. You'll never see that much difference in a hybrid trial planted alongside the field generally. Planting date was a big factor here. How often do you think about influence of planting date on light interception and plant populations? Generally, when you plant corn early in the season, it's going to achieve a shorter height because it grows through its vegetative growth periods when it's cooler. When you plant corn, say in central Mississippi or central Delta, North Mississippi, April the 5th instead of March the 15th, it's going to achieve a lot more height because it grows through those vegetative stages when it's a lot warmer, more conducive to growth, and it's going to get growthier. As you get really late into May, the height will start to fall off because of stress during those vegetative stages. But generally, the warmer it is when you plant, and the later you plant during the general optimal time frame, generally the taller the plants will get. So the corn on the right rather, was planted a good 4 or 5 weeks later than what this was, that was planted sometime in mid-March. But again, that has a tremendous impact on the light interception because of the extra height, the extra leaf size, everything involved that's going to intercept more of that light. And again, you'd like to get to 90%, but if you get higher than that, there gets to be issues again as well. Other thing is row pattern. You see twin rows in here. We already mentioned that you had the question about narrow rows. That's going to significantly impact the ability of those corn plants to intercept light and get to that 90% level. If you have 40-inch rows, you grow it in a relatively short hybrid like a DeKalb 6697 or 6772 that only gets 7.5, 8 feet tall. How well is that going to intercept light out in those row middles? You're probably going to see a lot of that light getting to the soil surface. So row pattern makes a big difference, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide, I guess, too. When you have wide rows, your plant spacing between plants and your competition between plants for light, water, and nutrients is going to be much more intense than it will in a narrow row. That's why the narrow rows generally are going to produce higher yields, because there's more space and more resources available for them to do their thing, particularly from a light interception standpoint.
Do you think twin row 38 is competitive with 30-inch?
No.
I think 30-inch is better.
Way better. Our research, most of the national research shows the twin row system in a wide row is going to be 3 to 5% better than the wide row.
Single.
Yeah, and that's national research where you're not growing it on a raised bed. Where we did our research in Mississippi, furrow irrigated production systems on a raised bed. And not only our research, when I say our research, that's mine, Dr. Ebel-Harris, Dr. Buring's, other researchers, Dr. Henry. A bunch of us has done research with different row widths. And we just basically aren't seeing any significant advantage for twin rows over a wide singles. And you kind of see that, I guess, there was a fair adoption of twin row systems, when those planters first came online
I guess the
and
advantage is in soybeans, and then we're growing more
Yeah.
soybeans, and we're growing corn. So the corn
Absolutely.
gets planted with the
And-
soybean planter.
part of the problem is, and Will got some firsthand experience with that this year with the planting system, but there's some inherent issues with corn on top of a bed. Number one, corn is very responsive to planting depth and achieving that uniformity. And when you have all that rainfall, soil erosion, uneven planting depth, you're not going to achieve that. We always see a lot more spindly plants, a lot more lodging issues, a lot more growth-related factors on twin rows. But also keep in mind, again, what's going on below ground, the differences in root systems as well. Corn is a fibrous rooted root system that goes down at a 45-degree angle. If you're planting it at the edge of the bed and have, how many inches of rain did we have? We had 80 inches of rain basically in the state this year. We're having a lot of root development issues, I think, in corn on twin row systems. And in general, not only is it a lot more tedious getting a good stand on twin rows, you just see enough of those problems that corn isn't providing the benefits or the yield response that soybeans or other taproot crops are showing in a twin row system.
Are you putting more seed at the twin row?
You can. It would be a little bit more responsive. Obviously, anytime you improve the plant spacing geometry, you give that plant more resources so you can increase your plant population a little bit. But, the bottom line is the twin rows just haven't consistently achieved any more significant, that they haven't achieved that theoretical, say, 5% yield enhancement that they should, or that they do on flat planted corn in the Midwest, in the South when you grow them on raised beds. If you're growing them flat, or underneath of a pivot, yeah, they probably would, produce 4 to 5% more corn, or somewhere in that 3 to 5% more. But it's not going to equal and produce the advantages that 30-inch row would, which is 8 to 9%, or 8 to 10%. And then hybrid selection. We know that different hybrids will respond differently to plant populations. That's something, I'd like to see more and more research from companies or from university researchers. We know that some hybrids, like a DeKalb 6697, is very responsive to higher plant population. Some of their newer hybrids, the 7027, which is our most popular irrigated hybrid now, is drastically different in its response to plant population. It's much more of what you would characterize with a flexier, where it increases, has a yield plateau somewhere, around the 30,000 mark, or it's going to flatten out and be a lot less responsive at a higher plant population. If I was a grower, from a management standpoint, I would much prefer a hybrid like that. You don't have to plant it at 38,000 to maximize its yield potential. So that obviously is very important. You also see big differences in hybrid plant height. I mentioned that the trials usually don't show a 4-foot difference in plant height, but oftentimes you do see as much as an 18-inch difference in plant height. And if I was in a 38, 40-inch row, the likelihood of achieving that 90% light interception is going to be a lot better with a 7027 hybrid or other hybrids that have a little bit more height on them compared to a 6697 DeKalb that's a shorter hybrid. So that basically, well, I'm going to show one more thing, I guess. This is a chart showing differences in plant spacing, in the row plant spacing with different row widths. And it just emphasizes, I guess, the difference that I was mentioning in response. With 38-inch row planted at, let's just say 32,000, it's going to have about a 5-inch plant spacing. It's going to have, I think at 32,000, it's going to have the same plant spacing. That 5.2 inches is what 30-inch rows would at 40,000. So get back to that question about why is 30-inch rows responding much better are yielding so much better than wider row widths, and that's one reason why. The plant spacing is spread out, you've got a lot more elbow room, you have a lot more nutrients, water, and especially light for those plants to utilize and produce those higher yields that we'd like to achieve.
More years on it, too.
Yep, absolutely. That's gonna be a component of that yield potential for sure, and we're steadily increasing that number, but, there's a lot that goes into making these decisions as far as what is optimum, that hopefully, you know, we shared a few things today that might help you in the future make some of those decisions or make some management considerations that you wouldn't have thought about in the past.
Do you have much data on 20-inch corn?
Not very much. We've got a little bit of research that we've done at Mississippi State. And in general, the national research is showing a little bit of yield improvement for 20-inch rows over 30s. The amount of that, magnitude of that response is not going to be as great as 40s to 30s because, for one thing, just the general size of the corn plant and the leaf architecture is big enough in a 30-inch row that you can intercept that light, 90% light interception in a 30-inch row fairly well. And I'm not intimately familiar with soybeans or some of the other crops. I would expect them to respond somewhat similarly. If you were in a crop such as maybe even grain sorghum or something like that that has a little sparser canopy, you know, you'll likely see a little bit better response to narrow rows with a little smaller crop or crop that doesn't have as much leaf canopy as what corn does. But in order to enhance yields long term, short corn plants are probably going to get shorter. Their leaves, instead of being held out like this, are going to be more oriented like this, so that you can have more leaves out there and get light to them, but it's spread out over more leaves, and it just feeds the plants better and supports more ears per acre bottom line. But most of the research is not showing, you know, if it's showing 8-10% yield response from 40s to 30s, the yield responses from 20s compared to 30s is, you know, certainly less than 5%.
Well, I was thinking in terms of, if we have 38-inch cotton, I guess what I should say was 19.
Mhm.
Instead of switching everything, you know, changing everything from 30-inch to 38, if you just split 38-inch, would that be well, could we make close to the same yields as if we had 30-inch corn?
Yeah, you would. And what one of our growers has done in that respect is they've got 3 about 18 and 19-inch rows grown on a 76-inch bed. And then they've got a wide middle that they can, you know, drive their tractor tires down and irrigate down. But they've got 3 18-inch rows on top of that bed, and that's been very productive. You know, I don't know how to characterize that compared to something else, because obviously that's a very unique system, and they're building their planter basically and their harvester. They're taking them in and modifying them in their shop to be able to work on a system like that. But in order to maintain and keep growing crops on raised beds, obviously you have to get varied. You have to do something like that in order to accommodate that. A lot easier on flat ground for sure. Any more questions? We're certainly, well, we're not too bad on time. We got about 5 minutes, I guess, before.
Eric, I'll ask a question. I get a lot of, people want to increase the plant population, thinking that's going to increase yield. So, question I get, and I'm sure you have too. So, if I want to grow 250 bushel corn, I'm increasing my plant population. What's your thoughts on also increasing the nitrogen rate? Do we need to increase the nitrogen rate or leave it where we're at?
it just depends on where they're at and what they're doing. And obviously, that's a very complex question
Yeah.
too. And in general, I would characterize that as, I mean, you and I've been doing what we're doing for quite a few years. I've got more gray hair than you now too, but we both had very dark hair at one point, in other words, is what I'm saying.
Well,
And
my response is, we've done some of that, and you add more nitrogen to the system, and you're not getting a
Yeah.
greater yield. So,
Yeah.
kind of like with your bucket there, something else is limiting.
That's right.
That's what I always hear is, okay, I'm gonna ramp my population up to 40,000.
I would encourage
45.
folks to look beyond the plant population and nitrogen. It's probably something else that's your limiting factor. We underestimate the negative effects associated with too much water. Last year, that was vividly evident when we had well higher than normal rainfall during the season. We saw all our heavy soils yielding, they may have had yields that were 50% less than the well-drained soils on the top side of the fields. Saw a lot of that last year. We saw hillsides that were, dry land ground that was out yielding the good bottom land ground. Very evident, I guess, the negative effects there, I guess, so. But it could be anything. Soil compaction last year was really, really big too. We didn't have the fall to do the things that we normally do in terms of field preparation. Had to do it in the springtime and created a lot of issues because of that.
You bring up nitrogen, but potash and phosphate also
Yeah,
could be a.
absolutely. And we're seeing magnesium and zinc and sulfur and, even boron and stuff like that that may be limiting factors as well. But to get back to Jason's question, what I was getting to with the gray-haired part of that was that we're still using the same nitrogen rates now that we were 15 years ago almost. I mean, it was a long time ago, folks were using 300 pounds of nitrogen, but we can do a lot of things from we've got nitrogen sources, nitrogen application methods, nitrogen timing, all those things will enhance our efficiency. These high-yielding corn growers, like y'all mentioned, I guess, if you do things right, you can produce a bushel of corn per pound of nitrogen. But in our environment, we can't afford to put it all out there in April and expect to achieve that type of efficiency because the rainfall and the soil saturation is going to cause tremendous nitrogen losses during the year. So whether it's putting out urea tassel, reducing your amount of application nitrogen that's going out in the first application, lowering our side dress application rate, doing whatever we can during the course of the season to increase that nitrogen efficiency is going to provide more dividends than simply raising the rate, I think. Of course.
Flying on some nitrogen and tassel, and I honestly can't tell you if we're helping ourselves that much with it. What's your thoughts on that?
You won't see it every year. I figure it as part of the program approach, in other words. I would kind of budget it, in other words. What you're trying to do with nitrogen, where you're going to run out during the year with nitrogen is usually at the end of the season. The corn plant's not going to pick up the nitrogen just because you applied it in March or April. It's going to be out there in the soil, and by putting out that nitrogen when it tassels, whether that's the 1st of May or whenever it is for you, that's going to reduce the exposure of that nitrogen to those wet conditions that are going to increase losses. So you're going to have more nitrogen available to finish that crop out in July. And when you have the wet years like last year, that's going to pay some dividends that you wouldn't see if you put it out there at side dress timing or earlier in the season. The more you can do to match the nitrogen use uptake during the season, the better your nitrogen efficiency will be. And that chart kind of starts off very slight, and actually over the first 30 days after the corn comes up, it's only going to use 6 to 7% of your seasonal nitrogen. So there's no reason to put out 50% at planting time. Put out 20% or 25%, and then come back from the time it's 30 days old or it's 12 inches tall up until tassel. It goes from 7% to 65% of its seasonal nitrogen. So that's why we put out that side dress application timing when the corn is 12 inches tall to meet that demand. We're not gonna fall behind there, but you don't wanna put out 100% at that time period, because then all the rainfall that we get during May is gonna enhance losses and reduce the amount of nitrogen that's gonna be able to be there to finish out the crop in late June and July. And that's where that tassel application is coming in very handy.
That 32% liquid, that's what I use on side dressing to put it out, one time. I don't have the time to come back and do a lot of farmers, you know, they come back with their high clear and drop it down. I'm thinking about doing that with a wipe, you know?
Yeah,
And, you know, around your fertilizer tank, you spill some fertilizer and nothing will grow there for 2 years. And when you put it down there, I've had it before in the next spring. I could see the green weeds of grass from where I put the fertilizer down the road some years. And I'm thinking, we talk about all this, losing all this fertilizer, and do we actually really lose a lot of it when we put it out? You know, because I've seen before, remember years ago, they're trying to put out the fertilizer and sits in the rain. Are they gonna wait and the corn gets up
Yeah.
6 feet tall and you can't even go through it, you know? So you hadn't got your fertilizer. I'm just saying, on my point of view.
Yeah, I mean-
Ask me about that fertilizer.
you can see placement issues like that, and you can even see some residual fertilizer, but that's extreme situations is what I'd say. And nitrogen is different than your other nutrients in that it is relatively mobile in the soil, and it does have substantial losses during the season. And we see most of our losses from denitrification, and those nitrogen losses can be as much as 5% per day. So if we have 20 days of soil saturation in May and all our nitrogen is out on the soil, we can have tremendous losses that, you know, are gonna show up even, you know, well early enough in the season that's gonna cause tremendous yield losses. We just have to do a better job of trying to account for that or minimize those losses and, you know, incorporate a more mid-season application, perhaps using a different nitrogen source that is not as subject to immediate denitrification or leaching losses would, you know, be a better option for you if you don't want, or don't have the capability to fly it on.
So you like a split application and then still fly 100 pounds
I've
on
flown it on
pre-tassel?
before.
Yeah, I mean, the more applications per season that you can apply, the better efficiency that you'll achieve. And I don't have that nitrogen chart, I guess, on this slide set, but that ought to be something we all keep on our phones and memorize it, you know, what it's like during the year, because if we do a better job of matching that, we're gonna do a lot better job of achieving that bushel per pound of nitrogen.
Bozo checks hours, and that's what he wants, that's what we do, and that's what he wants us to do, but sometimes the guys at Sanders will say, well, I don't know this, and they're selling it, and they'll say, I don't know if you see a benefit from the pre-tassel shot or not, you know, they'll say, maybe you do on heavy soils, maybe not on sand, but Bozo says, I don't care what they say, you know, that's the way I want to do it.
It's a risk-reducing option, and that's, you know, it's gonna pay off for you in the long run, probably, is what I feel like. Jason, you got anything to add to
Yeah,
that?
I think so. I mean, our data in Arkansas this past year, is like what Eric was saying, some years you probably don't gain anything, but you're not losing
You're not
any
losing
potential. But this year in wet conditions, you know, putting 100 units out pre-plant was the wrong thing to do. Maybe the right thing was to do was move some of that pre-plant nitrogen out to a pre-tassel. And anything we could spread it out from side dress to pre-tassel would probably benefit during the wet year.
Yeah,
In certain soils, probably more likely to see a benefit than others too.
wet
So-
years or heavy
So
soils.
starting off with-
what are the benefits of the stabilizer for installs that we hear now?
There's several different types, I guess. The Agritane MBPT products, all they do is protect surface volatility. So if you're putting out urea source or insol on top of the ground, which is gonna contain 50% of the nitrogen as urea, that's pretty important. Particularly if you're running one of these wide drops and putting out all your nitrogen on top of the ground. It's absolutely critical to use something like that then, because it's protecting what could be substantial losses. Another question I get a lot about is, you know, what about using these wide drop or going 100% urea in the south? The problem with any of those application methods with broadcast applications of urea on top of the soil is you need rainfall to incorporate it in the soil, or preferably overhead irrigation. If we get a 3 or 4 week dry period and don't get that incorporated, we're gonna lose a substantial amount of that. We might lose, you know, if it stays dry for 20, 25 days, we're gonna lose 15 to 20% of our nitrogen, even if we are treating it with those stabilizers. We'll lose a whole lot more than that if we don't treat it at all. But there's also some stabilizers out there which help with denitrification, which could be helpful. You've got 3 different types of losses that can occur during the year. Urea volatilization on top of the soil, and then in the soil, once it's incorporated, if it stays saturated and wet, you'll have denitrification where that nitrogen is released to the atmosphere as a gas. Or it can leach through the profile on sandy soils. Now, we don't have a lot of real sandy soils in Mississippi, but in areas like South Georgia where it truly is a lot more sandy, or you've got sandy soils, then leaching can be a serious issue too. But because of our high rainfall environment, we certainly have to take in all those things into account with our nitrogen sources and our application methods, and yes, the stabilizers.
Yeah, I was thinking you're talking about putting it in the ground, with my handsaw, like.
But if you put it in the ground, the surface volatility products won't help you much at all if you're closing your nitro slip. But there are some stabilizers out there that do help with denitrification now. Now those would still be helpful. And if you're like the other gentleman back here that was not incorporating a urea application at tassel, the stabilizer would be more important for you because your nitrogen is more at risk of denitrification because you're not coming back with that supplemental application to follow behind that. So it just depends on what you're doing. The more nitrogen you're putting out with that method, the more you have to do to mitigate the risk associated with that particular methodology and source. And the timing, frankly. It's all got to come together to make sure that